So another health metric is your critical path length index, CPLI. Now, while missed tasks looked retrospectively and tells you if your schedule is falling behind, CPLI is going to tell you how efficient you need to be to get back on track. And it'll also give you a warning if it's unachievable or not. So you're going to be looking at your remaining duration of your critical path and then your total float. Now, your critical path means that your total float is 0. So you're going to have to put a must finish constraint on your last task to say, match what your baseline finish was. Then it will give you a total float, whether positive or negative. If it's negative, it depends on how much, but if it's below 0.95, then that means you have to try really hard or it's almost impossible to get back on track. But if it's positive, it means that you can coast and you're doing fine and you actually have a little bit of slack to get behind somewhere and still be on time. This is looking at how efficient do you have to be to meet your deadline.
So the critical path length index metric, which we'll just call it for short CPLI, is a forward-looking measure of your schedule based on the baseline. So the missed task metric looked at the past, and this one is looking forward. And why it's important is while the missed task metric will tell you if you're falling behind, the CPLI will tell you what it takes to get back on track. It's going to tell you the efficiency that is required. It's also going to tell you if the efficiency required is unachievable, if you just can't do it. So the fields we're going to use to calculate this are the remaining duration, your total slack, and your finish variance. So you can calculate this two ways. One is a little bit more complicated, more steps. The other is a little bit simpler, but they both get you to the same point. And you can also use this metric on your entire project, or if you just want to pick a certain milestone or task, you can do that. The first way is to set a must finish on the last task in your critical path. And it's setting it to match the baseline finish. And this will change your total flow. So that's the goal, because I'll show you when we get into project that your critical path, your total float is going to be 0. So then you would always pass this metric because you would take the remaining duration plus the 0 because your total float's 0, and then you would always get it. So that's the important part, is you need to set the must finish on to what your baseline finish was. Then that'll change your total float. Then you're going to take the remaining duration. So project has a field that's called remaining duration, so you don't have to figure this out. You can just unhide that and get it from there. And so you choose the remaining duration of that task or milestone that's being measured. So in this case, we're using the entire project, or you could do it on just an interim milestone that's in the middle. And you take that remaining duration and you add the total float that you just figured out by putting that must finish on, and then you divide it by the remaining duration. So that's one method. The other method is take that remaining duration of the task or milestone being measured and minus your finish variance. And then you divide it by the remaining duration. And I'll show you this in project because before we were looking at the total float and you were adding it to your remaining duration. Your finish variance should match your total float because your finish variance, again, is looking at your baseline finish and your projected finish and calculating that variance for you already. So you kind of get what that total float is in the same method that you just used before. It's just, if you have slipped, it's going to give you a positive number. So that's why you have to minus. When you do the other, when you're setting your total float, it's going to get you a minus number. So it's just reversed. So that's why this method can work the same. You take the remaining duration and you either add your total float, or you take your remaining duration and minus your finish variance. They should match, but those are the two. Your goal is you want to be higher than 95% of your task. If you are more than 1, it means you've got enough slack in there that you don't have to be that efficient to meet your deadline because you've just progressed so well. But usually many people are not going to be above 1 for the larger projects. If you're less than 1, so again, we want to stay above 95%, but if you're less than 1 and definitely below the 95, it just means that your schedule is progressing inefficiently. And then this could be a warning that there's no recovery. There's no way you can get back on schedule because it is so far gone that even if you ramped up things twice and did 24-hour work shifts and all that kind of stuff, it's going to be harder and harder and you still wouldn't meet your end date. This is the whole point of this metric, is how much effort does it take to get back on track? And so 95% means you've got a shot. If it's below that, it means you've got to do some really extreme measures to get back on track, or you're possibly just not. It's unachievable to get back on track. So that's the importance of this metric. An example. So we're going to look at what is our very last end task of our critical path. And that's, in this case, ID 71. So we've picked it. Then we're going to look at what the baseline finish is of that task. So for ID 71, it is November 15th of 24. Then we're going to look at our finish date, which is the forecasting or promised finish date for that same task. And we're saying right now we're projected at January 8th of 25. So that finished variance is already calculated and it's 38 days. Because again, you're using baseline 0, not baseline 1, 2, 3, or 4, because the finished variance is calculated off of that. Then we're going to unhide the remaining duration field. And we're going to look at what the remaining duration is of ID 0. Now, why I picked ID 0 is because that's for your total project. Because again, we're looking at the end of the critical path in this scenario, and that is for my entire project. So if I have a milestone for just that end task, it's going to have the remaining duration of a very small thing, or it'll be 0 because it's a milestone. Or if it's that last task, we want to look at the remaining duration for the entire project, which is going to be the culmination. So in this case, it's 380 days left of our entire project. The calculation for this formula is we take the 380 days, remaining days, and we're going to minus the finished variance. Now, the other situation was we would have plussed the total float. When I go to project, I'll show you. And then we're going to divide that calculation by the 380. So you're adding your total float, or in this case, you're subtracting your finished variance. And in this case, we get a 0.9. So we are below the 0.95. So our schedule is progressing inefficiently. If we got a 1, it just means for every 1 day, we're on schedule for every 1 day. But then the lower you get below the 1, then it just means, okay, you've got to work 0.25 harder for each day, like put in a little 0.25 more effort for each task to get it back on schedule. So now we're going to take a look at project. So in project, I have the remaining duration field open, the total slack open, the finish variance, and baseline finish and finish. So in our example, we said that we are looking at ID 71. So I'm going to go down to ID 71, and it is our project completion. So that is our final task. So we can see in our final one that the baseline finish was November 15th, and now we're currently projected as finishing on January 8th. So that finish variance is 38 days. So we have slipped 38 days. But you can see my total slack is 0, and the remaining duration is 0. So that's why we want to choose the remaining duration for the entire project, which is ID 0. So if you can't find your ID 0, that's where you're going to go to the Gantt chart format and click this summary check bar. And that's where you can either hide it or unhide it by clicking that. So see how it's gone? If you click it, then you see it. So just make sure that's checked. Now we're going to take that remaining duration. So that's where we got the 380 days. Now we can just look at project 0. Baseline finish is 15, finish was 1.8, and the variance is 38. But you can see here my total slack is 0. So if I were to say the 380 plus the 0, then minus the 380, you're going to get a 1. That's where it was telling you to go down to set this is click on here, set a must finish on as your baseline finish. So that was November 15th of 24. Once I set that, it's going to say, yes, are you sure you want to do this? Continue. Then it says, okay, it's going to cause a schedule conflict. Do you want to continue? Yes. Now look what it did though. You now have a negative 38 total slack. And your finish variance though went to 0 because you now made a match because it was a must finish on. But again, you get the same thing. If I go back up to your project, this is where I'm saying you have the same number. It's just one is a negative and one is a positive. So you can take that to say, okay, your remaining duration of 380 plus the total slack, which in this case, it's a negative number. So you're essentially doing the same thing. It would be minus 38 divided by the 380, and you get the 0.9. Or you can take it where you just minus the finish variance. Because again, you're essentially doing the same thing. You're setting that must finish on of what the baseline is, but project already calculated it for you in the variance column. So you can take that. So that's the two ways that I was talking about of how you can do it. You get to the same answer. If you want to check yourself, this is how you can check it. Otherwise, if you don't set that must finish on, you're not going to get a total slack. It's going to say 0 because again, your critical path is 0. That's how you find the critical path. You have to set a must finish on constraint to get the negative number. Or you don't have to do that at all. You can just use your finish variance. Because once you set that must finish on, that's the other thing is you need to unset it again because you don't want that constraint in there. So you've got to remember to set it back to finish as soon as possible to get the accurate date. Because right now it's just saying you put that must finish on here. And if you look out to the right, you can see that even though all your project falls and it's showing that it should be in January, you made that finish on. So if you were to filter and say, yeah, your project's completing in November, you're giving false information if you were just to randomly filter on it because you don't see that must finish on and it's not predicting what it's really at. So the CPLI metric is a forward-looking measure, and it's telling you what efficiency is required to get back on track. It can be a warning flag to say that that efficiency is excessive and unachievable, and anything less than a 1 means that you are progressing inefficiently. So the missed task tells you if you're falling behind, and the CPLI tells you what it takes to get back on track. And there's 2 methods to calculate this, using your remaining duration for your total project and your finished variance or your total slack.